Hi, David. Okay, let me share the screen. And
Hello.
hello.
Rabbi.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, how are you,
Give me
Ken?
one.
Okay.
Give me a moment. I'm just getting the screen set up. Okay, sorry for that delay. I just had to reset up this device where I'm sitting in. But can everyone hear me and you can see the shared screen? All looking good?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good to see everyone. Good afternoon. So as you can see, today we begin a new set of halachot. Some of the ideas that we're going to touch on, we are kind of crossovers, like we had in last week's chapter as well, with some other laws that we've learned. But it's in essence, it's a new area of halacha. As you see in the introduction, there's 14 mitzvot, and in this first chapter, we're actually going to touch on 9 of the 14 mitzvot. So let's quickly read through the basic mitzvot. It's the laws of Issurei Mizbeiach, those things that are prohibited to be brought on the altar. And there's 14 mitzvot, 4 positive commandments and 10 negative commandments as follows. 1, to offer for all sacrifices only unblemished cattle. So number 2, not to set apart a blemished beast for the altar. Number 3, not to slaughter such a beast for the altar. Number 4, not to sprinkle its blood. Number 5, not to burn its fat on the altar. Number 6, not to offer up a beast with a temporary blemish. So the first ones we're talking about were something that was permanent. Number 7, not to offer a beast with a blemish even when presented by non-Jews. Not to inflict a blemish in cattle set apart for the altar, so don't cause that blemish. Number 9, to redeem cattle set apart for the altar, which have become unfit to be offered up. Because you might wonder, what happens if it was blemished or any of the things were done? What do you do then? So then you have to redeem it. In other words, you'll sell it. The money will then be used towards other sacrifices or other costs in the temple, depending on which type of sacrifice it had been previously designated as. Number 10, to offer a beast only.
You may not redeem. Okay.
No, you must. There's a mitzvah to redeem it. Because now that it's consecrated.
Okay.
Yeah. Number 10, to offer a beast only when at least 8 days old. Before then, it is immature and is not to be offered up. Number 11, not to offer up for sacrifice the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog. In other words, if this animal was used in illicit trade or unbecoming type of trade, we don't take that cattle then and offer it in the temple. Number 12, not to burn on the altar leaven or honey. Number 13, to salt all sacrifices. And number 14, not to omit seasoning all sacrifices with salt. So you can see 13 and 14 are two sides of the same action, same mitzvah. So we'll explain these in the coming chapters. And as I mentioned, today's chapter, we actually cover 9 out of 14. So to begin with, the positive mitzvah. It's a positive mitzvah for all the sacrifices to be unblemished and of choice quality. In other words, it should be a good quality animal. This is learned from the pasuk that says, Tamim yiyeh l'ratzon, unblemished. The animal that you offer should be unblemished to arouse favor. And this is the positive mitzvah. Conversely, as we learn in the second halakha, anyone who consecrates a blemished animal for the altar violates a negative commandment. So if you have an animal that has a blemish, and we spoke about in the previous chapters, the different types of blemishes that would make an animal, or in certain cases a human, unfit for service, right? So if it has any of those blemishes, that would make it unfit to be brought on the altar, don't consecrate it. And what we'll see through the process of this chapter is that the process of consecration is actually effective. It will now be consecrated, but it will be unfit for service, unfit to be brought as a sacrifice. So you cannot consecrate an animal that is already blemished. If you do so, you're violating a negative commandment. And as such, one is liable for lashes. Interesting, this is an exceptional, somewhat of an exceptional case. Usually a mitzvah that is only verbal, there is no punishment in the Torah. So although as a rule, transgressing a prohibition in the Torah, the punishment is lashes, it's not usually a case when we're talking just about speech. It's usually for an action. So this is somewhat of a unique halakha, that you are being punished for your words. And the reason is because your words immediately affect something material. The animal that you are consecrating is now transformed through your words. There's some activity taking place in the world. And for that, you will be liable for the punishment of lashes. Where do we learn this from? That consecrating a blemished animal is a prohibition. As the verse says, whatever has a blemish should not be sacrificed. Now, according to our tradition, we learn that this is a warning against consecrating a blemished animal. What we'll see here a number of times in this chapter is, although we won't get to contrast all the verses, is that this is basically a redundant verse. So what we learn out that is it's not just a prohibition to actually offer it, but it's even a prohibition just to consecrate it for that purpose, which it will now not be able to be used. Now, even one who consecrated such an animal for the money to pay for libations is liable for lashes, for this represents a disgrace to the sacrifices. In other words, there's different ways you can commit something to the temple. Either you can say this animal is going to be as a sacrifice, and if it's blemished, you can't do that. But let's say I want to offer this animal not for its body, so to speak, but for its value. I'll say I'm consecrating this animal so the value of it can be used for other things. He's saying that too is also liable for lashes if it's an animal that is blemished, because even though the temple coffers will be able to sell that on and make the money, right? And your intention was not that it was going to be a korban which it cannot be used for. Nonetheless, offering something that is blemished to the temple, it's, as he says, it's a disgrace to the sacrifices and is also considered transgressing this prohibition. Halacha Gimel, when a person consecrates an animal and intends to say that it is consecrated as a peace offering, but actually says as a burnt offering. You'll remember with verbal commitments, your words and your intention have to be the same. And if they're not, then the whole commitment is invalid. So if you thought you were going to offer this animal as a shlamim, but you say, I'm offering it as an ola. Now it's blemished, right? But because that type of commitment is invalid, right? So he says, or intended to consecrate as a burnt offering, or vice versa, right? And then said peace offering. His statements are of no consequence unless his mouth and his heart are identical. Therefore, if one intended to consecrate a blemished animal as a burnt offering, or consecrated as a peace offering, or intended to consecrate as a peace offering, but consecrated as a burnt offering, he's not liable for lashes, even though he intended to perform a transgression, because his words didn't take effect. If someone thought that it was, so that's one type of mistake, right? There's another type of mistake. If someone thought that it was permitted to consecrate a blemished animal for the altar and did so, the consecration is effective and he's not liable for lashes. So it's interesting, right? So his intention has to be that he's going to transgress in order to make him liable for this prohibition against consecrating a blemished animal. And the commitment has to be effective, i.e. his words and his intention have to match. Okay, halacha 4. This is already going to the next mitzvah. Hashachit balmum. One who slaughters a blemished animal for the sake of the sacrifice. So again, you should never have consecrated it. But let's say it was consecrated. And then the Kohen goes ahead and shechts it. So he's liable for lashes for the shechting it. As it's stated, do not offer these to Hashem. And again, this is again a redundant verse. So we learn that this is a warning against one to slaughter such an animal that has a blemish. Similarly, these are all steps in the process of offering a sacrifice, right? You have to shecht it, then you got to sprinkle its blood or pour its blood. So one who pours the blood of a blemished animal on the altar is liable for lashes. And again, we have a pasuk that says, do not offer to Hashem. And according to our tradition, we learn that this is a warning to one who pours the blood of a blemished animal on the altar, and also one who sets afire the selected portions of the blemished sacrifice on the altar is liable for lashes. In other words, you now took the meat and you actually put it on the altar. And again, we have a verse that says, do not place them as a fire offering on the altar. This refers to the fats, which is part of what you're putting onto the altar. Thus, we can deduce. He says like this: so one who consecrates a blemished animal, slaughters it, pours its blood, and then sets it alight, puts the pieces on the altar, is worthy of 4 sets of lashes. Each one is a separate prohibition. Halacha 5. One transgresses the above commandments whether the animal has a permanent blemish or a temporary blemish. He divides all of these commandments, as it says, do not sacrifice to God your God, an ox or a sheep that has a blemish. So whether it's something that is, again, permanent, that's not going to heal, or whether it's something that's going to heal, so long as the blemish is on it, even on an animal that's going to heal, so long as it's blemished, you would violate if you did any of these things, consecrate, shech, so on and so forth. So according to our tradition, we learn that this is a warning against offering an animal with a temporary blemish. For example, an animal had a moist skin eruption or a boil, that's considered a temporary blemish. If he sacrificed it, he is liable for lashes, even though it's something that ultimately will heal. We'll see towards the end of this chapter differences between something that is permanently, that has a permanent blemish or something that has a temporary blemish, and when it came about and so on. But as a rule, so long as the blemish is there, all these prohibitions apply. Okay, and as we learned in the introduction, this prohibition against offering or any of the steps in the process of the korban, of a blemished animal, applies not only to an offering from a Jew, not only is to the sacrifice of Jewish people, but also the sacrifice brought by Gentiles. If a priest offered such sacrifices and the animals were blemished, he's liable for lashes. As the Torah says, from the hands of foreigners, you may not offer the food of your God from all of these, meaning those blemished animals. Halacha 7. One who brings about a blemish in a sacrificial animal. This is the next mitzvah, right? Meaning an animal was consecrated and it was perfectly healthy. Now somebody comes along and wounds it. So, for example, he blinded its eye or cut off its hand. So such a person is liable for lashes. That's a prohibition. For regard to a sacrifice, the pasuk says, it shall not have any blemish. And again, this is a redundancy in the verses. So according to the oral tradition, we learned that this is a warning not to cause a blemish. Lashes are given for the violation of this prohibition only when the temple was standing, for then the animal was fit to be offered as a sacrifice and the person disqualified it. In the present age, by contrast, even though one transgressed a negative commandment, is not liable for lashes. I'm not quite sure how you consecrate something without the Beis Hamikdash, but it seemed like you can have a consecrated animal, but because practically it's not going to be brought as a korban, you would not be transgressing a prohibition if you went ahead and caused it a blemish. Halacha 8. If a person brought about a blemish in a sacrificial animal and another person came and brought about a second blemish, so one got blinded and then somebody else come and cut off the foot, the second person is not liable for lashes. Why? Because you're only liable for the person who causes it to no longer be able to be brought as a korban. This particular prohibition. Okay, halacha 9. This prohibition applies both with regard to one who causes a blemish in a sacrificial animal, in sacrificial animals themselves, or in animals to which their holiness was transferred. Remember the laws of Tumura. There's a law that if you want to swap out one animal for another animal, so these things are possible. What actually happens is that both animals end up becoming sanctified, but the same law would apply. The same would apply to the original sacrifice and to a new animal that you said I'm replacing that original sacrifice with. Both of them are considered sanctified for the Mizbeiach, and both of them would have the same rules with regard to blemishes, with the exception of a firstborn or a tithed animal. In those instances, one who causes a blemish in an animal to which their holiness was transferred is not liable for lashes, for they are not fit to be sacrificed, as will be explained in the appropriate place. Basically, with other sacrifices, both of these animals, the one that you are transferring and the original one, will end up being brought on the altar. When it comes to the first one and the tithed animals, that's not the case. And therefore, you're talking about an animal that is not going to end up on the altar anyway, and therefore these prohibitions of causing blemish doesn't apply to it. Similarly, one who causes a blemish in the 9th animal, which was mistakenly called the 10th, is not liable for lashes. This is another instance where you have an animal that is set aside as consecrated, but will never actually be brought on the altar. when we talk about tithing animals, so the farmer would have to take the animals through a pen, and he would count 1 to 10, and the 10th one he would say, this one is holy. The one is if he miscounted and he called the 9th one holy. So though it wasn't the 10th one, because he designated it as holy, it's consecrated. But because it wasn't actually the 10th one, it's the 9th one, that animal doesn't have the same sanctity as the true 10th, and is never going on the Mizbeiach, and therefore will not be subjected to the prohibition of causing a blemish. Okay? Halacha 10. Although one consecrates a blemished animal for the sacrifice of the altar is liable for lashes, the animal becomes consecrated. And I mean, we've understood this premise all along, but the Alter Rebbe said, the Rambam says it clearly, that you're not allowed to do it, but if you did it, it's now consecrated. So what do you do with it? Because you can't bring it on the altar. So this was the next mitzvah. It must be redeemed after evaluation by a priest. It then reverts to the status of an ordinary animal. Now, as you take the animal and you'll sell it, and the money that you get from it will be used for another korban. But this animal itself can now be used outside of the temple. And we'll soon see what type of use it can be put to, or if there are any restrictions. But the point is that it reverts to the status of an ordinary animal. It's now a profane animal, and its money should be used to purchase an animal for the same type of sacrifice. This law also applies when a consecrated animal contracts a disqualifying blemish. In other words, as you consecrated it, it was fully healthy. It got wounded, it got a blemish. What do you do with it? You can't bring it on the altar. You sell it, and with the money you buy a replacement animal, and that animal itself can now be used in a regular profane way. It's a positive mitzvah to redeem sacrificial animals that contracted disqualifying blemishes and cause them to revert to the status of an ordinary animal so that one may partake of them. This process we just spoke about in the beginning of the halakha is saying this is a positive mitzvah. As the verse says, nevertheless, whenever your heart desires, you may slaughter and partake of meat. Now, again, what does it mean you can slaughter and partake of meat? What type of meat is this? It means meat that originally wasn't available to you and now is. As he says, according to our tradition, we learn that the verse speaks about consecrated animals that must be redeemed. And he says, we already explained in the Hilchos Arachin, with regard to any impure animal, of which a sacrifice should not be brought as an offering to God, you shall have the animal stand before the priest, he evaluates it, and then it's sold. And we know that it's speaking about blemished animals that have been redeemed. And this is what it refers to, again, in the verse that we read above, that you can eat from that meat. Okay, so now we've spoken about two types of blemishes in an animal, permanent and temporary. So what's the difference? Where will there be differences? What are the differences between the laws pertaining to an animal with a permanent blemish and one with a temporary blemish? We know so long as the blemish is there, all the prohibitions that we've spoken about apply. But here's going to be the differences. If an animal with a permanent blemish gives birth while it is consecrated, right? Because remember, you have a mitzvah to sell it, to deconsecrate it. But if it gave birth while it was still consecrated, the offspring must be redeemed because it has the status of holiness of where its mother currently was. It then receives the status of an ordinary animal, even if it is unblemished. In other words, it's not right. Even if it's unblemished, in other words, technically it itself didn't have to be sold, but it should be because it's born to the mother that needs to be sold. The rationale is that a secondary entity should not be treated with greater severity than the primary entity. If its mother cannot be offered on the altar, it cannot be offered on the altar, even though it's unblemished and must be sold like its mother. If it became, now what is if you had an animal with a permanent blemish that's still not yet deconsecrated? If it became pregnant before it was redeemed and it gave birth after it was redeemed, the offering has the status of an ordinary animal. Because in other words, it's redeemed with its mother. So it doesn't be redeemed separately. It's just as it is. If the consecrated animal that was blemished died before it was redeemed, it should be redeemed after it died. The rationale is that that holiness never encompassed its actual body only on its worth because it had a permanent blemish. Meaning like this, if you had an animal that was unblemished, okay, just to appreciate the halacha, that was designated to a korban, but it died before you offered it as a sacrifice, you'd have to bury it. Okay, because the body itself has holiness. It cannot simply just be sold as a dead animal, because the process has to be, in order to sell it, you would have to have the animal in a state that it could be brought on the altar and then valued and sold. But if the animal dies and it was unblemished, it dies with its holiness, so to speak, and cannot just be sold off. But our animal that was consecrated as a blemished animal, right? The body never really became sanctified. Only its worth became sanctified. And therefore it retains worth even once it's dead. So again, somebody consecrated a blemished animal. They weren't supposed to do that. That animal's never going to go into the Mizbeiach. And now it dies before you are able to sell it. You sell its carcass and you use that money for korbanot. Something that you would not be able to do with an animal that was consecrated whole and remains healthy and then dies. Right? If by conscience one consecrated an animal that possesses a temporary blemish, okay, so now something different. What happens if you consecrate an animal that had a temporary blemish? That means right now you can't bring it as a korban. But eventually you will be able to bring it as a korban. That means it does gain inherent sanctity, even though right now it's not sanctified. Similarly, he consecrated an unblemished animal, and then only after he consecrated it, it contracted a permanent blemish. Again, that means that at some point, it has inherent bodily sanctity. Unlike our first case, where it was blemished when it was consecrated, it never had inherent bodily sanctity. It only its worth had sanctity. So in these two cases, where you consecrated it with a temporary blemish, or you consecrated it unblemished and then it got blemished, now of course and now it dies before it was redeemed. It should be buried like other unblemished consecrated animals, because it must be because if you would have wanted to sell it, it would have to have been stood before the court and evaluated, as we explained in Hilchot Arachin. And because you can't do that, it's considered a sanctified animal that is died and just needs to be buried. If it was slaughtered before it was redeemed, so again, it was something that either had a temporary blemish or originally consecrated unblemished and now was blemished, and now somebody shechts it. While it's still convulsing, you sell it. In other words, there's still signs of life in it, and you sell it. In other words, you redeem it, you deconsecrate it, then you can actually partake of that meat. Okay? Because as long as there's life in it, it's considered that you could stand it up and evaluate it, which are the two processes that you need to have in order to deconsecrate it. If it gave birth, its offspring may be sacrificed, okay, because it has inherent holiness, and the offspring has inherent holiness. You don't have to redeem the offspring, like we said by the animal that originally had a blemish. What happens if it became pregnant before it was redeemed? And it gave birth before it was redeemed, the offspring is forbidden. It may not be redeemed. So what should be done? So here's the story. Sorry, let me just, I lost that a second. If it gave birth, its offspring may be sacrificed, fine. Now, if it became pregnant before it was redeemed and it gave birth, sorry, let me just go to the Hebrew. I'm getting confused here. Right, sorry, there's a mistake in the translation. And then it gave birth after it was redeemed. So then it's forbidden. It may not be, because it's got a certain sanctity, the offspring, because the mother became pregnant while it was still sanctified, but it's born after it was redeemed. So because after the mother was redeemed, it maintains certain sanctity, you can't do anything with it. You can't use it for personal use, and you also can't use it as a korban because its mother's already been redeemed. So if you know that you've got an animal that was originally whole, then was blemished, and now you're going to sell it, and you know that it's pregnant, what should you do? Before the mother is redeemed, the offspring should be dedicated to the same type of sacrifice as its mother. And therefore, even once the mother is redeemed, you will then be able to use that animal as that sacrifice. Because if you don't do that, it may not be offered, because the sanctification of its mother, because its holiness comes from the sanctification that was suspended. In other words, if you don't dedicate it at that moment before you sell it as its own korban, then it ends up being, like we said, neither holy nor profane. You can't do anything with it. It has some sanctification that comes from its mother previously, but it's also now in a state of redeemed animal, and you can't do anything with it. Therefore, what you must do is dedicate that animal. Let's say you had a korban shlamim, a cow, and it's pregnant. You have to sell it now because it got a blemish. Just before you sell it, you say the fetus, I'm dedicating as a korban shlamim. And then even once the mother has been deconsecrated, redeemed, that child animal could then be used as a korban. The final halacha for today. Whenever a consecrated animal that was disqualified is redeemed. So you've now taken it, it was blemished, you sold it. So it may be slaughtered in the butcher's market and sold there after being weighed with a scale like ordinary meat. The only exceptions are the firstborn animals and the tithes. But any animal that was dedicated to other korbanot, you can sell it, weigh it as every other animal. The rationale for this, but not for firstborn animal and tithes. He says the rationale for this distinction is that selling the animal in the market causes its price to rise. Remember, what's going to happen? You're going to sell the animal to someone. What are they going to do with that animal? They're now going to take it and sell it on. So long as they can sell it on for full price, they'll be willing to pay the Beit HaMikdash full price for it. What the temple is going to use it for their money is to buy other korbanot. But when it comes to the firstborn and animals that were tithed, we'll see those are not going to be replaced with another korban. And therefore the temple is not going to gain anything from it. So therefore you can sell it for a lower price. When the person who's buying it is going to be basically supplying the Beit HaMikdash with money to replace that animal, then you sell it at full price because they can sell it on for full price. But when it's not going to be any gain to the Beit HaMikdash, the money that they're going to take from redeeming it, that it doesn't have to, it can't be sold on in the same way, right? The rationale for the distinction is that selling the animal in the market causes its price to rise. Therefore, other sacrifices whose values remains consecrated, for they are sold, and the proceeds of the sale are then used to bring other animals as sacrifice. So then it should be sold in the market like ordinary animals. So the person who's redeeming it knows they're going to get full price. In contrast, with regard to a firstborn animal and a tithed animal, since the proceeds of their sale do not remain consecrated, instead the animals may be eaten as ordinary meat because of the blemish, as will be explained. They may not be slaughtered in a butcher's market or sold there, even if because their value is not going to come back to the Beit HaMikdash. Now, even if the value of the firstborn animal was consecrated, meaning he says, whatever I'm selling it for, I'm going to take that money and sanctify that money now to the Beit HaMikdash. So it would seem that the money is, the full value is going back to the Beit HaMikdash. It should not be weighed in a scale and sold in the market, the meat of that meiser animal or the bechor. Why? Because one may consecrate only an article that he has acquired in a complete and total manner. Basically, the Kohen doesn't have the right to sell that because it doesn't belong to him. He therefore can't consecrate the money that's going to come in from it. Okay, so there we go. Conclusion of the first chapter. We come up to half an hour. Let's quickly go through the questions, get a bit of a review, and we'll wrap it up. If someone thought that it was permitted to consecrate a blemished animal for the altar and did so, what is the law? Either the consecration is not effective, but he does not receive lashes. The consecration is effective, but he does not receive lashes. A or B?
I think B.
B is correct, right? In all the instances, it's effective, right? You know how they do it's effective. In the case where his intention was not to transgress, he doesn't get lashes because he didn't know it was a prohibition. Okay, according to oral tradition, the verse which states, do not offer these to God forbids. Ooh, we had a lot of verses. Let's see if we remember this one. One, to slaughter a blemished animal as a sacrifice. One, to consecrate a blemished animal as a sacrifice. One, to pour the blood of a blemished animal on the altar. I think it's A. I hope I got that one right because it's offer these, but we had a few of these redundant verses. Let's see. Okay, we got it right. Okay. Number 3, does the prohibition against offering a sacrifice that has a blemish include the offering of a Gentile? Yes or no? Simple answer. Yes, it does. Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And number 4, what is the status of an animal that had a blemish and was redeemed? So let's see what the options are. It may be slaughtered and eaten in an ordinary manner, but it should not be sold and weighed like ordinary meat. It must be treated in a more respectful manner by selling it separately from other meat and eating it separately, or it's treated like ordinary meat.
Number 3, maybe.
Ordinary meat.
Right, okay. Excellent. So there we go. We got through that. Shkoyach, everyone. Nice to see everyone again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thanks,
Thank
Rabbi.
you, Rabbi.
You too.
Cheers, everyone.
Much hasacha.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Zagizun, take care. Have a wonderful